Okay, so welcome to this week's episode of The Path Less Chosen, the podcast showing the careers they don't teach you about in school. My name's Sol.
I'm Jamie.
And this week's episode is Phil from EasyA. And EasyA is simply described as Duolingo for blockchain. They've just reached 1 million developers, and I can't wait to get Phil on. Met him at a hackathon and thought he'd be an unbelievable guest. But Jamie, let's find out what we can expect from today's episode.
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting one. He's a fascinating guy as well as being incredibly clever. So he's going to take us all the way along his journey from selling paper airplanes at school to building an education platform for over 1 million users. He's also going to tell us about how he became one of the youngest to ever pass the US bar exam, which is incredible in itself. And finally, he's going to tell us more about his lifestyle now, which involves flights every 3 days.
Unbelievable. Can't wait. And so many interesting points for anyone interested in blockchain, crypto, but also starting their own company. So buzzing to get into it. And yeah, without further ado, let's do it. Okay, so just before we get into the episode, we are trying to grow our Instagram. We think it's a great way and a great medium to tell you about all the great episodes we have on. We're putting out more authentic content, hopefully about Jamie and I and what we're trying to do with this podcast. So if you wouldn't mind just giving it a quick follow, and interacting in any way that you like, then that would be absolutely amazing, and you can keep up to date with everything that is the Path Less Chosen. All right, let's get Phil on. Okay, so Phil, thanks so much for coming on, mate. My first question is, what you've achieved is pretty impressive so far, but how much do you think that is down to clearly being a pretty intelligent guy, or how much do you think is down to other things like hard work, spotting right opportunities?
That's a great question. I think it's a mixture of everything, but no need to flatter me. Yeah, obviously, we've done very, very well over the past couple of years, better than we could ever have even imagined. And I think that holds an interesting part of it, right? You never necessarily know exactly how you're going to achieve things. And I think that is because it's a little bit of everything, a little bit of all of the above, right? Working hard, it's also having a little bit of talent along the way for what you're doing. But I think that it's really a combination of leaning into what you're already good at. So over the past, founded EasyA about 4 years ago now, started off with what I was already good at. So that was namely coding, obviously knew a lot about Web3 as well, and just liking building startups, having built 2 before as well in the past, and then leaning into those skills and becoming even better at those and figuring stuff out along the way, because I think that nobody really has a concrete path for what exactly they're going to do. So yeah, I think it's a mixture of both.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned EasyA there, and I know we've come in with quite a hard-hitting question to start with, but just so we don't lose our audience. Yeah. So just so the audience don't get lost immediately, I think it's worth just giving a bit of context. What exactly is EasyA, and in kind of layman's terms, what is it that you do?
Great question. So EasyA is Duolingo for blockchain. Duolingo being the language learning app that people use to learn about like French, Chinese, Japanese. I think they've got a ton of languages on there right now. We're doing the same, but for tech. And so if you think about Duolingo as teaching people the languages that you speak, so modern languages, EasyA teaches people about Web3 languages, things like you might be familiar with Solidity. Most coders will be familiar with things like Rust. So those sorts of languages, we teach them those languages and also how to use them within a Web3 context.
Amazing. And I've experienced the ecosystem, it's absolutely blowing up. Didn't you just reach 1 million users as well? Fairly recently.
Yeah, we reached 1 million users a couple of weeks ago, so we've been celebrating that over the past couple of weeks too.
Amazing. Well, massive congratulations on that. And
Thank you.
Going all the way back then, so when did the interest in Web3 and coding and blockchain actually come about for you, Phil?
A long time ago, actually. So I first came into blockchain in 2013. So looking back, it's 2024 now, September 24. This was summer of 2013. That's over 10 years. So pretty much over 11 years ago now, actually. And I was a student at school at the time. I was actually studying for my GCSEs, or meant to be studying for my GCSEs. I distinctly remember sitting in the computer gallery at school, meant to be revising, meant to be printing off some past papers to be studying for, and I stumbled across, I don't know exactly how, but I stumbled across this thing called the Bitcoin White Paper, of course, written by Satoshi Nakamoto, and it talked about this idea for having a peer-to-peer form of money, essentially. Peer-to-peer electronic payments enabled by the blockchain. So I was absolutely fascinated by it. Very, very short paper, but it tackled a lot of topics that were very, very close to heart and were very top of mind right then. Of course, released just after the financial crisis. Everybody was still talking about it, and very, very much in the public consciousness. Really went down the rabbit hole, went back home, locked myself in the basement at home, and really just learned everything I could about Bitcoin over the next couple of weeks, and invested in just contributing to this network. So, learned about pretty much every 3-letter word you can name, or 4-letter words. So like, GPUs, PSUs, CPUs, FPGAs, ASICs, all this machinery that you need to run and to mine Bitcoins as well. And that was the beginning of everything. And so that was, 11 years ago now. It's time has really flown by.
That's insane. I mean, we talk about a lot of path less chosen on this podcast, but to jump back to like 2013, the idea of blockchain and the whole Bitcoin concept was obviously so foreign. So how was that, particularly given that you were still of school age? Did you not like think at any point, like, what the hell am I doing here? And did people not ask you, like, why are you so invested in this stuff when no one really had a clue what was going on, particularly back then?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
I even wondered myself, like, why am I so obsessed with it? My parents were wondering, why are you spending all that time in the basement? What are all these wires and all this equipment? Like, what's going on down there? Definitely, 100%. And I think that at the time in particular, it was really a subset of people who were involved in Bitcoin at the time. It was nowhere near as big as it is today. 2013 was an interesting time because I think Bitcoin was about $100 or so back then, or had spiked to maybe a couple of hundred max. Hadn't really crossed anywhere near the levels that we see today, and of course that was reflected in the interest that there was in it at the time. 2013 was a year of a lot of different coins coming out as well, but really it was just the beginning of everything, and it was, I would say, past the curve of nascency. It was past that stage, but it was really the time when more and more people started coming into the space, and I think it's the first wave of new people who really came into the space.
Amazing. Yeah, I wish I'd met you back in 2013. What was quite noticeable is that you then went on to actually take like the US bar exam and to be one of the youngest to pass that. So talk to us about like how that came about. How did you go from being a blockchain obsessed to then taking the bar exam and going down that route?
That is a very good question as well. I was obsessed with computers when I was at school. And as a teenager, as a pre-teenager actually, I learned to code. So I learned to code even before I was 13 years old, been coding for a very, very long time. When I was applying to university, well, I had planned to study computer science. Really, when I was applying and coming to it, looking at universities and looking at the subject choices, of course, in the UK, you have to choose exactly what you want to study pretty early on. You don't just go into university and you're like, I can figure this stuff out and choose what I want to major in 2 years on, like you have in the States. And really, I would say that it was a combination of a number of different factors. When I was applying, I knew that at that stage I could build anything I wanted to build already. So I could build mobile apps, I could build websites, and that was what I was really excited about. I could already build all these things and get them into users' hands. And so I was like, well, you know what? I'm also watching quite a bit of Suits at the time. Well, why don't I go ahead and apply for law? So ended up going to Cambridge, was a scholar there, ended up topping my year as well, and really afterwards was like, well, okay, let's continue this thing. I sort of knew that I wanted to do my own thing, so at university co-founded 2 startups as well at the time, so EasyA is our third. But then I was like, you know what, let's get this bar thing done, let's finish it. And so I headed off to New York and took the bar, ended up being one of the youngest people to qualify as an attorney there. Just, on a, not really a whim, but sort of bought this book online. I was like, okay, let me just give it a go, end up passing, and now I'm still technically an attorney.
Wow, that's insane. I mean, so much stuff to pick up on there. I think probably the biggest thing is the majority of our demographic of listeners aren't going to be top of their year in Cambridge. They aren't going to be able to pass at whatever their age the US bar exam, right? And especially when you also mentioned that you went and knew at this point already that you were able to build whatever you wanted, like apps and things like that, right? So for anyone listening who's kind of thinking, okay, this is way out of reach for me, like I'm never going to be able to get there. Is there anything you could kind of give them as a sense of encouragement to be like, actually, yes, of course, you're a very intelligent person, but there's other bits that go into it that might allow people that aren't quite at that intellectual level to also achieve the same kind of things?
Definitely. I don't think I've ever shared this before, actually, but I'll give you a story of when I was in my first year at Cambridge. I was like really, really worried that I wouldn't be able to keep up actually at university. So I was there, and you start term in October, it's sort of winter, nobody really knows each other, and everybody, you're like, wow, I'm in this, really being thrown in the deep end. Everybody around me is super, super smart. And I was going into these supervisions, and everybody around me, like, they seem to know all the answers as well. And I was petrified. I was like, oh my God, what if I'm not able to pass the exams at the end of the year? Because you have to keep a certain standard, right? Like, a couple of people every year don't quite make the cut to go on to the next year. I was like, no way, I worked so hard to get in here. What if I'm not able to continue in it? Sort of comes back to the question you kicked off with, Sol. I was like, well, am I able to work hard enough? Am I smart enough to do it? And I think that at the time I was like, well, maybe I'm not smart enough. Maybe I'm not good enough to be able to actually continue it and stay in this place. And so I really just worked really, really hard. And by the end of the year, the results came out. They came out a little bit delayed. Like, I kept on pressing the refresh button. I was like, oh my God, what if the results aren't coming out? What if it's because I've been kicked out? I mean, that bad. They're not even sending through the results. And I refresh the page, and it comes up with a grade. And it's 1 with an asterisk on the end. I'm like, my God, what if that asterisk means that you are actually so bad that you've been kicked out? I'm like, what does the asterisk mean? And I look up the asterisk, and it actually means you didn't just get a first, but you got a first starred. That's a starred first, so a first with distinction. And I was like, whoa, no, surely this isn't right. Like, how did I do that? And I think it's that, that sort of underconfidence in a way. I was like, well, how did I even do this? Like, and surely if there is an asterisk there, it means that I didn't do well. So I think it really ties back. Didn't really think that I would be able to do something like that. And it was really, really through hard work and just applying myself throughout the whole year that enabled me to get that to that level as well. And so, to answer your question, Jamie, I think that, myself, I've had talent, but in many ways as well, I haven't necessarily recognized it myself, or at least at an early age, or when I was much younger, I didn't necessarily recognize it. And I think that everybody has to figure that side out on their own. And at some point, you will figure it out. At some point, there will be that sign, which sort of is that moment when you realize that when you apply yourself to certain things, you can achieve them. But until you reach that moment, sometimes it feels like, well, what am I even good at? Like, maybe I'm just really run-of-the-mill or worse than run-of-the-mill.
I love that. What a story. And also so comforting to hear for probably people listening who are like, oh, well, everyone sat in Cambridge in a position you are is probably very confident, knows exactly what they're doing. And to think you thought that asterisk might have been a kind of like, oh yeah, first, but we're kicking you out sort of style.
Yeah, exactly. Thank God it wasn't.
Yeah, it's so funny, so funny. And so moving that on to EasyA, when did you first start seeing success with EasyA, and I guess start with maybe where you came up with the idea, and then when did you first be like, okay, I've got talent in this, I think this is going to go somewhere?
A great question. I think to answer the last question first, in terms of when I started really thinking about this sort of thing or starting to learn about startups, that goes back to I've been sort of doing startups when I really think back to it or look back on it for a long time, as long as I can remember. I mean, startup is really just any enterprise, and that's the way that I think of it. It's not necessarily an app, it's not necessarily a company that you form. It's really just having a bit of hustle and being an entrepreneur and doing stuff. So I remember at school, this was actually at primary school, I was probably about 7 years old, just going into the art gallery, taking some paper, and I had this method of making paper aeroplanes. And I would go take the paper, I would then fold up these airplanes, and I would sell them in the playground. And so I'd sell them for like £1 or £2, and that was my enterprise. And in some ways, I feel like that might have been the first startup that I ever created. And then that continued throughout school, not necessarily with airplanes, but just building stuff. So I mentioned that by the time I was applying to university, I knew I could build anything I wanted to build, whether it was apps or websites. And that was just because of the things that we launched along the way, just like getting stuff out, shipping them. And so flash forwards to university, co-founded 2 marketplace startups, scaled those, and then after exiting those, then when I then went and became an attorney, I knew that I had to come back to it. And so EasyA, really, we actually, the story of that is very interesting. We can come into it maybe in a moment, but we actually founded EasyA not as what it currently is today, but as a peer-to-peer tutoring app. And so that was really the beginning of it. And a ton of lessons that we learned along the way about building startups, but actually, and this will be helpful for people who are watching as well, or interesting, I'm sure. What we actually started with is not what we, actually envisioned it to be today.
So how did that progression happen, and how has it become what it is today? I think what's interesting is obviously you're teaching something which is still a fairly new concept to a lot of people, but I guess how you see it and how the company sees it is that it's probably one of the imperative skills that everyone should be learning in this day and age, right?
100%. 100%. So I would say that the mission is, still very much the same, is to educate people and help them achieve their full potential. But the means by which we've done that has changed. And I think that Mark Zuckerberg actually put this really well. There's this snippet from his Harvard commencement speech where he says, there's a big mistake that people make, which is that people think that ideas come out fully formed. They really don't. And you just have to work on them. And the more you work on them, the more the idea actually takes on a shape of its own. So when we first started EasyA, and this is one of the reasons why it's called EasyA, is because the idea was it's easy to get an A. And we saw this huge problem, which was at the time our younger brother was doing his exams, and he would come to us and ask for help. He'd say, hey, do you remember how to do this maths equation? A lot of the time we were a little bit beyond that, so we sort of forgotten. But anyway, we'd try and help. And more often than not, we could figure things out. But he'd come to us all the time, and we thought, well, why is it still like this? Why do you still need to go and you spend ages trying to get the answer from someone? If you want to ask a question in school, you're afraid to put up your hand. Nobody wants to ask the teacher because it sounds like, for whatever reason, people feel dumb doing it. And, I'm sure that this will relate to a lot of people. I never really liked putting up my hand in class. And I think that that's a feeling that a lot of people have. People have tutoring after school. And so we thought, well, what if we could change this? What if we had an app that allowed anybody to push a button, take a picture of the question they were stuck on, and get connected with somebody who could help within minutes? So sort of like Uber for tutors. Anyway, I ended up getting that, did tremendously well throughout COVID, but we were just growing so fast that scaling that was, just becoming a real nightmare at the time. So I ended up converting that into current EasyA that it is today. And it actually came across when those paths, obviously there's a path less chosen, those two paths that we were just talking about really aligned. So the path that we were on with EasyA, with the education app, and then the path that we originally started on way back in 2013, which was blockchain. And that was, we were catching up with one of the friends that we'd met through the blockchain ecosystem and through Web3. And he saw all these amazing people that we brought on board as tutors or mentors. So people from all these top universities in the UK and the US, and saw this and said, well, what if we could get these people learning about our technology? We have this amazing tech, it's this amazingly growing and vibrant ecosystem. It's something that they should know about anyway. What if we started teaching them about it? What if we used the app to do that? And that was really the beginning of the transformation into what EasyA is today. We hosted our first hackathon in London and really just saw this huge demand from people to learn more about this technology. And at the end of the day, also to build startups. And so mission has very much stayed the same. It's to empower people, to allow people to be educated more on what is important to them. So it started off obviously as being maths and science. And today it is the world's fastest growing technologies, Web3, and likewise as well.
Amazing. I mean, just before I jump into my bigger question, can you just summarize what a hackathon is, just for anyone that doesn't know?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of people think that a hackathon is where essentially black hat hackers, people just get into a basement and then start hacking into
That was me.
Government or banks or things like that. Definitely not that. I'm not a hacker in that sense. Hacking is really just a way to refer to building stuff quickly. So if you're hacking at a hackathon, it's usually a 48-hour event or 36-hour event. Saul will know it very well as well. He was at our Cambridge one, where people come together, they have these ideas, and they just build them as quickly as possible. And really, if you've seen The Social Network, then they have a lot of hacking scenes and hackathon scenes. It's pretty much that sort of thing where you go and you build something as quickly as you can.
Yeah, I knew that, of course. So to go into my bigger question then, what I find really interesting is that you told us that even by the time you went to university, you knew everything there already. You've always had this knowledge, like you've been in blockchain since 2013, right? So that's a long time. And I imagine you weren't really in a position where no one was ever going to force your hand to go and help and educate other people. And obviously you identified this opportunity as being something that you could build around educating people, whether it was in blockchain or otherwise, where it just started to help your brother with maths problems. But what was your kind of motivation behind it? Was it purely the fact that it was a business opportunity? Because I find it amazing that someone in your position was actually like, no, I really want to just help and educate other people, right?
Yeah. Definitely wasn't just the business opportunity. It was at one of the highest paying law firms in the world and left it all, started with nothing. So my salary went to zero.
Amazing.
And that was a huge leap to take. I think that most people still don't want to take that leap. Nobody wants to leave a really high paying and comfortable job where there's a very clear progression. And it was really the mission. I've always wanted to do something bigger. I was looking at my path And I think that this is a similar thing to what a lot of people feel. You look at your path in your early 20s and you're like, where am I going to be by the time I turn 30 or 40? I looked at that and I saw this progression. I saw, okay, well, I'll become a senior associate and then a junior partner and then a senior partner, maybe at some point become a managing partner. But I thought, well, what contributions will I really have made to the world by the time I get to 40 or 50? And I didn't really like the future that held for me. So I was looking at, well, how can I actually contribute more to the world? How can I really have this lasting impact on the world? And education was really the biggest thing that I saw, the biggest problem that still to this day is very much unsolved. And that was the reason that I left it all behind and went all in on EasyA.
Now, how did that feel? Like, just get into the depths of that, because I'm sure one of like a lot of our listeners, one being on this call, is very interested in how that actually feels to leave that and go all in on something you love.
Scary, but also great. Mark Andreessen put it really nicely. I think he said that as an entrepreneur, you have two emotions. One is this state of euphoria, feeling on top of the world, and then a state of sheer terror. And that really sums it up very, very nicely. You only have two emotions. And I think that when you first start off, it really is more on the euphoria side because you have this huge mission, you feel liberated. But Brian Chesky, one of the co-founders of Airbnb, put this very, very nicely, and I always refer back to this when I'm talking to any entrepreneurs or any people who are just starting out. And he said that there's this pretty much this graph when you're starting out. And when you start off, you have this honeymoon period where everything's going great and you're on top of the world, you know what you're building, you think you know what you're building, and that's the problem perhaps. You have this mission, and then what happens is you inevitably launch and things don't go quite right, or you launch and things do go well and then something happens. And then he refers to this thing called the trough of sorrow or the trough of despair, and it's like you just go to rock bottom because things aren't working out. Maybe you're not able to monetize, you're not able to generate enough money, you're living off ramen, move back in with your parents, all of this, and you can barely make ends meet. You don't know why on earth you left your job to do this. It's just really, really difficult. It's like chewing glass. And you go through this, but if you're able to make it past that, then it's this very, very nice ascendancy afterwards. And I think that that's a really, really good way of putting it. It feels great when you start off, you've got this honeymoon period, then you've got this trough of despair or sorrow, and then things, like, as long as you can get past the trough of despair, things start to get better.
I love that. Phil, you must have watched one of my Instagram videos where I drew that out on a whiteboard. I assume that's where you got it from, not the co-founder of Airbnb, right?
It wasn't Brian Chesky, that was you.
Yeah, that would have been my video, I'm sure. But yeah, that's so interesting. And just to give us a real insight into that journey for you, have there been times when you've been sat there and thinking, this was a bad idea? Have there been things that have gone wrong that you've thought, it's time to pack it in? Or have you been pretty constant in your mindset that this is going to work out?
Definitely. I think that if you're asking whether I ever thought I would go back, that was probably one of the scariest things. When I think this was probably about even a couple of months, maybe a year in, and this was like, we were deeply invested, right? We'd put all of our savings into the company, things weren't quite working out, and it was like, well, what am I even doing? If I go back, will they take me back? What will I look like? I'll be a year behind everybody else. So it was petrifying, definitely. But I do still think that I never, even though I considered or I thought about it, I never really, obviously never went back, but I also don't think that I ever lost sight of the mission because I just believed in it so deeply. And I think that's because I thought about this for so long before I made the decision finally to leave my job at the law firm. I've been building startups, as I said, like for so long and been building them at university too, that I think that it's because I had that really, really informed decision, that I knew what I could build, I knew what the potential was. And I also just thought, like, if I don't do this, then, like, and if I do go back, like, what's the point? So I had made that decision for myself, and I wasn't going to go back and just quit.
I think listening to that, it's a fantastic story, and now with the fact that you're over 1 million developers signed up to it, I mean, that's a sign that you've had some real success with it, right? And what I'd be interested in is, like, what is the kind of lifestyle that comes with that success? I know we mentioned off call that you're on flights every 3 days. Is there a cost of the success where you're traveling a lot, or is actually that a perk of the lifestyle you're living?
Well, when I look back to COVID and being in lockdown, I think that I much prefer how it is today, being on a plane every day. Yeah, it's a lot of work, definitely. There are weeks where you barely get a couple of hours of sleep every evening, and there are sometimes months like that too along the journey. But really, I think that it's just because of the mission that all of this, it just pales in comparison to the work. Like, when we look at how big this can get and what it means as well. So Web3, there are so many different ways to describe it. And I think so many people have a lot of misconceptions about what it is, but really in a nutshell, it's the next phase of the internet. And it really is that big. And so many people are going to benefit. It's going to liberate so many people and empower so many people. So we look at that like, we just hit 1 million users, which is great, but we want to have 1 billion. And that's not just like a selfish thing of saying, hey, we want to have 1 billion users and we want to monetize or whatever. We want to have 1 billion users and 1 billion developers because that's the only way that we can really free ourselves from these problems that Web 2 has created for us. You know, we've got huge Goliath companies like Google, like Facebook, which are just trying to extract as much value out of people as possible. Web 3 is a response to that, and it's going to change so many people's lives, and that's what really keeps us going. Like, yeah, the lifestyle is pretty interesting. We'll come on to maybe a couple of stories about that in a minute, but really it's just like the mission is so big that it makes everything a lot easier.
Lovely. And as you say, we'd love to hear the lifestyle. Notably, the two things that I saw through following your Instagram is being behind the deck with Steve Aoki and also your sleep scores or your sleep seeming to be less than 2 hours most nights of the week.
Yeah, definitely. I've got my Apple Watch, so it's pretty sobering to look at that thing sometimes. Yeah, we hit 1 million users and we work together with amazing partners. So yeah, we were just in Singapore. Yeah, managed to see have three DJs, and you know, in 3 nights it was Dylan Francis, Steve Aoki. Didn't get caked. Actually, I don't think he brought a cake out, which was a little bit disappointing. But then there was Diplo as well. So yeah, behind the decks with those guys. And yeah, the lifestyle is definitely something that is nothing like anything you'd ever have elsewhere. You know, that was really amazing to celebrate, but it's really, you know, the 0.0001% of the time. A lot of it is just grinding, working hard, being up until 3 a.m. in the morning, coding, shipping something, or working on a new release. And, you know, a lot of being on planes now as well. So, yeah, there was 1 week this year where we were on a plane every single day. And that got a little bit sickening. There's something about being in the air, I think, that just, being in an airplane with all the circulated air that really is physically sickening in a way. But yes, it's, I honestly think that what we have today is, there's nothing I'd rather be doing, especially given that we're on this path.
Absolutely love it. And then just to touch lastly on the kind of new exciting news out of EasyA that we saw you're launching your own university. So give us a bit of an insight into what's going on there.
Yes, this is really exciting. We are launching the EasyAX Polkadot University, and really that builds on a lot of what we've seen ourselves. So you can think of EasyA as having a couple of different elements. We have the app, which is what inspires people about Web3 and shares with them what it is all about. Then we have the hackathons, which you know very well, Sol, and it's really where people come and they launch their ideas. But what we found was missing for a lot of people is what happens next, right? Because this is really much the path less chosen, right? It's really, I love the name. There's no guidance on really what you do. Like, there's tons of handbooks on how to get into law, how to get into banking or investment banking or finance or consultancy. But how do you do this whole founder thing? And that's really why we founded the university, because what we saw was that a lot of people in our community have become very successful. And they built companies that are now valued at over $2.5 billion, which is insane.
Jeez.
Like, serious unicorns. Yeah. At a very young age. Like, all these guys are pretty much early 20s. What we found is that for other people, though, like, how do you even get to that level? As you mentioned, Jamie, it's like you look at that and you think, well, how do I ever get to that level? And so the university is there as a way to show to everybody how you can do it. It's more of a slightly more formal way of bringing on board these mentors and these people who've done very well and showing them how it's done and having a pathway for them into entrepreneurship. So that's what we're doing. We're going to be working very closely with some of our biggest university hubs over at Harvard, Chicago, Yale, Stanford as well, on really embedding this in. So you won't need to drop out of those places in order to drop into our university. We'll be working alongside, but it's very exciting, and we're going to open doors in, well, we'll be announcing it probably in the next 6 weeks or so.
Wow, that's fantastic. I think it's a brilliant initiative that you guys are doing, and I can imagine it's going to be a really exciting time over the next few years for EasyA. So thank you for sharing everything with us. We always like to finish with our final question. I think if we were to jump back to maybe the time that you started to become interested in blockchain perhaps, and then the journey you've been on since there, if you were to go back to that time now, what is one thing you would definitely do the same, one thing you would do differently, and then one thing you would tell yourself to motivate yourself?
That's a really, really good couple of questions. What would I do the same? I think really the reason that I got into this was because I was just very curious and just went down the rabbit hole. And I think that that's probably something that I have always kept up. It's just that curiosity. Especially as you get older, you see a lot of people who close their minds and become way, way less curious. I think that's one of those things that I've always just retained, just naturally. And it's the reason that I got into Bitcoin in the first place. It's the reason that I really, well, even at the time it wasn't really Web3. I think Web3 was really something that was coined around 2015. It's the reason that I continued learning then about Web3. It's the reason that I got into coding in the first place. And I think that going down the rabbit hole and allowing ourselves permission to go down that rabbit hole is something that's so, so important. Something that I probably would have wanted to know or would have told myself if I could go back to 2013. I was 16 years old at the time, so I mean there are so many lessons that I would have told myself, but I think this is something which is really, really important for anybody who's just starting out as well. And it's that every overnight success actually takes 10 years. I know that people say this a lot, but it genuinely is the case. And I think that everybody thinks that when you start something, it's going to happen like very, very quickly. If not overnight, within a couple of days or a couple of weeks. But genuinely, for the world's most valuable startups and the people who've created the most value in the world, really only start. Well, you'll start to see it. You'll start to see it a little bit earlier than 10 years. But other people will start to see it in 10 years. So that when you look at somebody from the outside, it looks like they had this incredible ascent. Because they're going to be one day, they're suddenly going to be on the cover of Forbes. Then they're going to be on Bloomberg, on CNBC, on CNN, on the BBC, doing everything all at once. But really, it was a long journey for them to get there. So I think that that's something that I would have told myself. Maybe actually I wouldn't. That's a good question. Because I think a lot of that is actually being foolish and not thinking that it's going to take years. And you think that the next change could just be around the corner. So I don't know, maybe that's one of those things where I would have allowed myself to go down the rabbit hole. Maybe I wouldn't if I'm looking at my 16-year-old self or myself when I was starting EasyA and I wouldn't tell old Phil or young Phil rather how hard it was going to be. Maybe that would be one of the things that I would say. But yeah, I think that would be what I would go back and say to myself, and also one thing that I think I did very well along.
Fascinating answer.
Mate, absolutely great. And we've actually never had someone kind of debate their answer, which I think is so interesting. But you think that, right? You're like, well, actually, why would I tell myself? Because I wouldn't change a lot that you did. And I think you need that naivety, right?
Sometimes you do need that naivety. Sometimes you do need to have that foolishness, like Steve Jobs would say. Steve Jobs, stay hungry, stay foolish.
Yeah, so good. Stay hungry, stay foolish. What a great way to end the episode. And mate, ever since we chatted at that hackathon, I was very keen to get you on. And for sure, when I saw you at 2-3 along with all the hackers, I was like, this guy's into what he's doing for sure. So very, very happy to get you on, and you delivered, and looking forward to sharing this with everyone, because there's so many learnings along the way. But thank you very much for your time and for giving up your Saturday to chat to us.
100%. And thank you so much for having me on, Jamie and Sol.
Okay, brilliant conversation with Phil. What a genius, first of all. He's obviously a very intellectual guy, but some of the messages he shared are so relatable and kind of gives the floor to everyone else to make of it what they will, and then go on to do things perhaps as special and as amazing as what he's done. So good to get into some key takeaways from the episode then. Sol, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think exactly what you started with and what we started the podcast with there is that actually you look at his CV and you're like, this guy's just ridiculously clever. And actually he talks about the 10-year journey, and the kind of people only see the 0.1% of your success at the end, that are all the great parties that you have and the celebrations. But that long journey is unavoidable. No matter how clever you are, no matter how dedicated you are, you just have to stick at that. And that was a massive takeaway for me, that it will work out, but you do have a long ride ahead of you if you're looking to start something like this.
Yeah, 100%. And that kind of leads on to my second takeaway. Like, everything you're going to see on what he's doing with EasyA at the moment is very surface level. You don't see, it's like the iceberg analogy, you know, the classic one. You don't see everything else that's gone in behind that. And actually, like, he's talked about the fact that when he was back at school, he was selling paper aeroplanes, and now he's managed to have a few startups and then conjure up this idea that's led to EasyA. But actually, when that idea was formed, it didn't come out as perfect as it is and might seem on the surface now. And I think the really important message that he shared is that those ideas will never come out fully formed and they'll never come out perfectly. It takes a lot of like tinkering with, it takes a lot of like working on them behind the scenes to then actually make them into the viable product and fantastic business that he's got now of EasyA.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, and it really touches on the point that you actually just have to start and just start doing things. And once you start doing things, you can iterate and change your ideas. But most people have such a paralysis and fear of starting that they kind of don't get the time to change their ideas. Yeah, massive one for me there. Agreed. And then just nicely capping off, I think, the third one is he talks about the valley of despair, which I love as a concept, and the thing that gets you through that and has gotten through a lot of the things that we've just spoken about is being mission driven. And yes, he's probably making a load of money. Yes, he's probably like, you know, flying around the world, living a great lifestyle, but he genuinely does have a very like interesting mission and believes in his mission. And I think that is what you need to power you through those difficult times.
Yeah, really good. Yeah, it comes back to my question that I asked him about what his motivation was behind it, because he doesn't have to go and educate people, but he's doing it actually because that's his mission. That's something that he's passionate about. So I love that message. 3 good takeaways there. So I'll sum up quickly. The first one being that people only see the 0.1% of what you're putting in. The second one being that ideas don't come out perfectly, they need working on. And the third one being be mission driven.
Spot on, mate. Lovely episode. Absolutely loved getting him on. Feels weird that I did a hackathon with him and now he's interviewing on our podcast, but I guess that's how we meet some unbelievable guests. So yeah, just to wrap up, if anyone listened and enjoyed, check out EasyA. If you want to learn more about blockchain, then check their app out, and also we'll link everything in the description. If you could leave a rating on this episode or any episode you enjoyed in the past, we'd really appreciate that. 5 stars or 1 star, any rating is better than nothing, and we will catch you next week.